Standing behind Ukraine, European leaders joined President Zelenskyy in his meeting with Donald Trump. The Ukrainian leader is under pressure to accept a deal to end the war. Washington is promising security guarantees in return. But will that really end the conflict? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Adrian Finighan. According to Donald Trump, it is possible to end the war in Ukraine. It just needs President Volodymyr Zelenskyy to agree. But for Zelenskyy, agreeing to anything that means losing territory to Russia is not only difficult, but may be impossible under Ukraine's constitution. Several European leaders are joining Zelenskyy in Washington for his crucial talk with President Trump after his summit with Vladimir Putin in Alaska. There are reports of a possible deal on offer, but European leaders want to ensure that there are security guarantees for Ukraine and the rest of Europe as well. So is this the beginning of the end for Russia's war in Ukraine? Is it possible for Zelenskyy to agree to a deal without ceding any land to Russia? And what does it all say about Europe's position in the world? We'll get to our guests in just a moment. But first, this report from Imogen Kimber.
US President Donald Trump says Russia's war in Ukraine can end almost immediately, but it's up to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy.
Again, Mr. President,
this comes on the heels of a meeting between Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska.
Thank you very much, Vladimir.
Reportedly, Trump now has a deal to offer to Ukraine.
Oh, that's an interesting one.
Posting on his platform Truth Social, he says, Crimea is never coming back, and there will be no NATO for Ukraine. When Zelenskyy landed in Washington for his meeting with Trump, his social media post told a different story. He wants a lasting peace that doesn't involve giving land to Russia, and says Crimea should never have been annexed. Just the day before, Zelenskyy was in Europe.
I
don't know what Putin and President Trump actually talked about, and I want President Trump to tell me and the European leaders a lot of details. And the fact that President Trump gave a signal about security guarantees is much more important to me than Putin's thoughts, because Putin will not give any security guarantees.
Our conversation with President
5 European leaders, including the German Chancellor, UK Prime Minister and French President, are also in Washington to support Zelenskyy. They want to strengthen Ukraine's position, but also ensure European security.
If we are weak today with Russia, we are preparing the conflicts of tomorrow, and that will affect Ukrainians. And make no mistake, that can also affect us, so there can be no weakness.
Whatever is proposed to Zelenskyy, according to the Ukrainian constitution, he cannot simply give away Ukraine's sovereign territory. That's a decision that needs a national referendum to let the Ukrainian people decide. But even then, there's no indication it will end the war. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Now, we should point out that we're recording this Inside Story a couple of hours before the meetings in Washington get underway. By the time you hear the discussion, anything might have happened. We'll try, though, to keep it as time-sensitive as we can. Let's bring in our guests. From Kyiv, we're joined by Peter Zalmayev, Executive Director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. From Geneva, we're joined by Jean-Marc Rickli, Head of Global and Emerging Risks at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. And from Düsseldorf in Germany, we're joined by Matthias Nellis, CEO and co-founder of the German-Ukrainian Bureau think tank. Thank you all for joining us, gentlemen. Peter, we'll start with you. To what extent could these talks today be more important for Ukraine and for European security than Friday's summit in Alaska?
Well, I think it's crucial. I think Donald Trump ostensibly came prepared and armed with some sort of guarantees of whatever they discussed with Vladimir Putin, including, during that mysterious private ride in Donald Trump's limo called the Beast, with no translators, no one present. We don't know what went on behind those scenes. But yes, Donald Trump is feeling confident that, it's all in President Zelensky's hands, which to me is a code for Zelenskyy better negotiate or Russia will invade and occupy all of Ukraine. That is sort of the storyline that Vladimir Putin seems to have been able to sell to Donald Trump. And what I'm really concerned about is that Donald Trump is motivated by his impulsive desire for that Nobel Peace Prize. And he does not want to bother with so-called fine print, with fine details of any of the land swaps that are being proposed. And this way, I'm afraid Ukraine may be walking into a trap. And that's precisely why Ukraine's European allies decided to accompany President Zelensky, because it is a trap set by Vladimir Putin. Very, very, very simply, if Ukraine says yes to negotiations about land concessions, that could lead to unrest on the streets of Kiev and sweep Zelensky out of power. Or if he says no, then Vladimir Putin will be able to point at Ukraine and say, Donnie, you see, Ukraine is the intransigent party here. They don't want to negotiate. That's why that explains this entourage of President Zelensky, a very, very sensitive moment in the war.
Jean-Marc, feel free to comment on what Peter was saying. Of course, President Trump upped the pressure on President Zelensky ahead of the meeting when he posted on the Truth Social platform that the Ukrainian president could end the war almost immediately, that Ukraine wouldn't be allowed to join NATO, and that he wouldn't be getting back Crimea, in his words. What do you make of that?
Well, here you have already two concessions that Ukraine should be ready to accept, which is not joining NATO and then forgetting about Crimea. Both were very important goal for Ukraine. Now, obviously, after the years that we've spent fighting on the ground, obviously facts on the ground are for now providing some advantages to Russia, and there might be an exhaustion on Ukrainian side. Nonetheless, what Trump's remarks are doing is actually to put the responsibility for the continuation of this war on President Zelensky. President Zelensky could potentially will have to accept some condition, but that will be depend on the extent of the security guarantees that he receives from the United States and from the Europeans. What is key here, and this is maybe what has changed with previous discussions, the meeting in Alaska, is that potentially the US is ready to commit some forces into reinsurance force. But for now, we don't know the exact details of what American commitment could be. And this is what basically the Europeans are actually, and President Zelensky are negotiating today in Washington.
OK, we'll come back to those security guarantees in a little while. But as we've already said, Zelensky won't be in Washington alone this time, as he was when he was publicly mauled by Trump and his vice president back in February. Will this so-called dream team of European leaders be able to persuade Trump away from the positions that he appears to have adopted since his meeting with President Putin in Alaska? What will they need to do to persuade him? What tactical advantage does Zelensky have having them there in Washington?
Right, Adrian. I begin by saying that Trump flip-flopped. Before Alaska, he was speaking of a ceasefire, his objective. Now he demands a comprehensive peace agreement, and Europeans and Germans in particular, but that holds true for most of the continent, view that skeptically, that because the Russians stick to their maximalist war aims, and it is not just about Crimea or NATO membership. Russian maximalist war aims are about, size of military, other territories, including the Donbass, that Ukraine cannot just trade away. So Ukrainians are going into the meeting supported by the Europeans, that trying to shield some pressure from Donald Trump and Putin away from Zelensky. And they're trying to find out more about the deal that Trump actually negotiated, because beyond the glossy headlines, it's unclear what the security guarantees actually look like. And they're trying to make the case to Vladimir Putin in extension, but first and foremost to Trump, that a lasting peace really requires that it's just and fair. And that really is difficult to imagine in this very moment.
Peter, I wonder how important the inclusion of NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte is in the European delegation. What pressure can he apply to Trump? Will personal dynamics between the leaders shape the outcome of these talks?
Well, Mr. Rutte, his pressure is that of flattery, and that's the only thing that works with Donald Trump. And Mr. Rutte has been, an example of how to do business with Donald Trump. I actually have met Mr. Rutte at various international conferences. He's a very capable individual. We hope that he's got that key to Donald Trump's heart. His argument will be that, Donnie, you're doing everything great. Without you, this peace would not have been possible. You've brought us, to its very realization, that very moment. But let's just do one thing remaining. I mean, before we consider any land swaps, and which, once again, don't forget, the formula is at the outset is quite unfair. You're swapping Ukrainian land for Ukrainian land, right? So at the very least, how do we reassure Ukrainians that what they will get in return is something ironclad, such as the security guarantee that would be equivalent to that of NATO's collective security agreement? But then there we run into a problem of Russia. But then, of course, once that's done, that will be up to Russia to respond. I suspect that Vladimir Putin will not be happy with that. He was not happy to countenance even the presence of peacekeeping troops from what he considers hostile countries, such as Britain and France. So that sort of guarantee may not be a starter, but that's not really our concern right now. We need to put the ball in Putin's court again. If Ukraine says that at least it will be willing to consider some formula for the de facto, de jure recognition of Russia's control over the territory, let's lay it out on the table what sort of security will be provided. We've already been through this when Russia was one of the signatories of the so-called Budapest Memorandum of 1994, which guaranteed Ukraine security in return for its nuclear weapons. It returned back from the Soviet days back to Russia. Well, you see how well that worked. So right now, Donald Trump is talking about Russia's written pledge not to attack Ukraine again. Obviously, as a security guarantee, that's not good enough for us.
Jean-Marc, how might Russia's president be viewing this meeting? I'm going to ask you to speculate here, but with anxiety, confidence following his meeting with Trump on Friday? I mean, his red lines for ending the conflict haven't shifted at all, have they?
Well, that's the issue. When Steve Witkoff's statements were about the fact that Russia could potentially agree to Article 5 type a security guarantee for Ukraine by the US and the European, we have to actually take that statement with some pinch of salt, because Vladimir Putin has been consistently arguing that the war was also about NATO enlargement, the fear that basically NATO was the threat that the NATO was presenting to Russia. Now, if that is the case, that President Putin would accept such a condition, that would be a major reversal of position. I think that it's more likely that it's a negotiation tactic, and Axios was actually mentioning yesterday that Russia would actually consider potentially China as a security guarantor. So the devil is really in the detail. But as I said earlier, I think what could be a major change here is if the US would actually commit to a security guarantee with Ukraine, similar to what the US have done with South Korea or Japan. Is Donald Trump ready to go that far? That is also unlikely. Then the second best would be that the US actually provide the so-called backstop force for a reinsurance force that the European are starting to build. And so here, the US, the role of the US would be crucial, because it would provide assets in the field of air power, intelligence, and other type of military capabilities that the Europeans do not have. But the details are, the devil is really in the details. And if we look at the trajectory of President Putin's position on security guarantees in the past, it would be very surprising if he would agree on such a reversal of position.
Matthias, I want to get your thoughts on that. What might these security guarantees that Trump has talked about look like? What kind of support might the US be prepared to offer? This proposed Article 5 style security guarantee outside NATO, is that viable? I mean, what form might it realistically take?
Right. It's Ukrainians view that, again, skeptically, first and foremost, because they are not willing to trade, say, the remaining parts of the Donbas they control, even for the most credible security guarantees. That I want to preface here. If you're talking about 300,000 people living in Kramatorsk-Sloviansk, the fortress belt of Kramatorsk-Sloviansk, they're not willing to trade that away, even for US boots on the ground, I reckon. But the US guarantees are very murky at this point. So how could they look like? You know, Trump has been flip-flopping all around in his positions. So whatever he says has to be contractually put down. And even then, the question is, will US troops deliver on their backstop, supporting Europeans on the ground in Ukraine? Even that is a big question mark. Or better, having some sort of reassurance, participation in the reassurance force on the ground in Ukraine. But at this point, no one in Kyiv or in Germany believes that the US is really credibly investing into the security guarantees to an extent that will make Vladimir Putin deviate from his maximalist war aims, which again, he feels emboldened. He feels he can continue this, drag out the negotiations for as long as needed to advance on the battlefield, put Ukrainians into a position where it is forced to accept a Minsk-like agreement. And this is what we have to prevent by asserting more pressure on Russia through providing Ukrainians with arms and ramping up the economic pressure on Russia. And this is what the Europeans are trying to get out of Trump as well, to convince him that without any pressure on Russia, he can't and he will not have any ceasefire or even a peace agreement.
What then, Matthias, could a country like Germany do, for instance? The Chancellor is there in Washington for these meetings.
Chancellor is one of those interlocutors. We heard of Rutte and the kind of Ruttery, as it's floated on the internet, the charm approach. And we have also President Stubb from Finland, who has the president's ears, and Friedrich Merz, the German Chancellor, is somewhere in between. He's respected by President Trump, and he's trying to mediate as well. He will make sure that this is not just about Ukraine or some territories. This is about European security, and American interests are at stake. So we are trying together in this group, we as Europeans are trying to convince Trump that Ukraine and Europeans are the ones interested in peace, in a lasting and just and fair peace. And it is Russia that is the problem, and we will not get Russia away by doing nothing or offering a simple concession. That is capitulation and not peace.
Peter, Matthias there was talking about the so-called fortress belt of Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. How does that fit into all of this? It's a prize that Russia desperately wants, one that Ukraine cannot afford to lose. How might Ukraine's constitutional ban on ceding territory shape the discussions? I mean, to what extent is President Zelenskyy caught between a rock and a hard place here, given the pressure to accept land concessions like Crimea and Donbass? I mean, does he have any room to maneuver?
It is indeed, has been already called, I've seen the poison pill. That's how it was characterized, this sort of deal. I am from that area, my grandma lived in, I'm from Donetsk, my grandma lived in Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, I know all these areas. These are the areas Ukraine still controls, with a large population of 200,000. That constitutes about 15% of the Donbass, but those are the major towns that have been indeed turned into fortresses since the first incidents of Russia's aggression in 2014. And so these, what you call in the military jargon, are commanding heights from which, should Russia be given them, it will be able to attack Ukraine again. I mean, we've been there before. Russia was de facto in control of Crimea in 2014, and the Western powers sort of lived with that, right? Treated as a fait accompli. Well, did that satisfy Putin? Did that prevent him from aggressing again and gobbling up more territory? So Ukrainians are naturally, they've been taught this bitter lesson. They're naturally wary of what Putin will do next. His goals remain the same: by hook or by crook, to control Kyiv politically. It means Zelenskyy out of power, full political control of all over Ukraine. And that's precisely the formula. If Zelenskyy decides to move on that, that will, as I said, may lead to some serious unrest. And Donald Trump, as you saw, was quite dismissive of Ukraine's constitutional matters. He said, well, if Zelensky is willing to send people to their death or kill, why does he talk about the Constitution? There is no mechanism whereby the president or even the parliament can sign off on the handing over of Ukrainian territory. It has to be decided by a national referendum, which cannot be held in time of war. Imagine the sort of chaos that will create, precisely a poison pill scenario that very cunning Vladimir Putin is feeding to the very impulsive, chaotic American president who is after his goal, as I said, his Nobel Peace Prize. He does not really want to get down to the nitty-gritty, but the nitty-gritty of this is a matter of life and death for Ukraine.
Jean-Marc, would European leaders settle for any peace deal that would involve Ukraine ceding territory to Russia? Will they be able to put up a united front on that, persuade Trump somehow that they're prepared to go it alone if he won't come around to their point of view?
Well, that's also a very important point, because as we've seen in the past, Europeans have spoken with different voices. Obviously, the security interest or the threat landscape looks very differently whether you are based in the Baltic states or if you're based in Portugal and Spain. And so here the unity of the Europeans is very important. So last month there was a coalition of the willing meeting in Rome, and about 30 countries agreed to beef up, if you want, this force, which is about regenerating land forces in Ukraine, so having troops underground for training purposes, then securing Ukrainian sky by doing police mission, and also supporting safer seas by basically demining the Black Sea. Now the question is, if we are really serious about a reinsurance force, we'll have to talk about boots on the ground. And here, obviously, this is where most European countries are very reluctant to commit. And we have already some statements, for instance, from Greece, that they will not commit forces in Ukraine. So here you have the issue of a US commitment, but you have also the issue of European unity. And this is basically so far what is lacking. Now, if the US are ready to commit, then maybe this could be a game changer.
Matej, what are your thoughts on that? If the US security pledge somehow weakens after this meeting, are European leaders willing to go it alone? Will the coalition of the willing that Jean-Marc was talking about play some sort of role in supporting Ukraine without US security guarantees? Do they have a plan B?
That's de facto what's happening as of now. We are trying to buy arms, or we are buying arms, or the Western coalition of the willing is buying arms from America, which is itself phasing out its own deliveries. So support of Ukraine is continuing in this format. But I wanted to make two more points. There is the Ukrainians are going out on a limb and offering things. It's not that they are going and saying, we are saying niet or ni to anything that the Russians propose. They are willing to talk about de facto recognition of control over Ukrainian territory. So this is a difference between de jure making them recognize the occupation and ceding that, right? The Ukrainians are saying, we are willing to talk potentially about NATO membership in the future. We're willing to put this on the table. And Kramatorsk, Peter was saying that is largely important because it's a military height, but it's also important because it's, as Zelensky was saying, it's a springboard for future offensive. From there, it's a few miles to the Kharkiv Oblast, and it's really, you can threaten from the industrial heartland of Dnipro, where really important military industrial production is going on. So the Europeans are trying to talk reason to Trump to make him understand that they are the ones supporting Ukraine. But we can and will do it without the US, but it's way more difficult without the US.
We're rapidly running out of time. We've got about 3 minutes left. So a question for each of you, but a short answer if you can give me one, less than a minute. Peter, what are the broader implications for European security if these talks in Washington fail to produce anything other than a durable, multilateral roadmap to peace?
The consequences are dire. I mean, Ukraine is actually running out of manpower. It's going to be very hard defending itself if Donald Trump decides not to even sell weapons to Ukraine using European money. And the consequences of Ukraine's collapse, I don't even want to think about this, but imagine that's millions of more Ukrainian refugees spilling over the border, and Ukraine actually controlling the Ukrainian manpower of millions of able men who will be then drafted into the Russian army, and the war will come to Europe's doorstep.
Jean-Marc, do you agree to that? Will today's meeting bring us closer to peace or simply serve to expose further cracks in the Western alliance?
Well, it depends on the outcome. As I said earlier, if the US are ready to commit forces to this reassurance force or to help the Europeans in very important ways, that could play a role to change the balance of power on the ground. If no agreement is reached, the burden will be on the Europeans. But the issue, as we've seen over the last years, is that it is not only difficult to speak with one voice, but there is an issue of capabilities generation. And so far, the Europeans do not have the military capabilities to replace the United States. So if there is no agreement, so what we'll see is probably a continuation of the dynamics that we've seen so far.
Okay. Matthias, as I said at the beginning of today's Inside Story, we're having this discussion in the hours before this meeting takes place, so it's impossible for us to know what might happen. But is there a danger, if things don't go well, that the situation could actually get worse? More division, more doubt, less unity?
The minimalist goal is to keep the US selling its weapons to Europeans, providing its intelligence sharing. But the situation, let's be honest, is dire for Ukraine, but it's not hopeless. Russia has lost about 1 million soldiers trying to storm Ukraine and the Donbass. So its resources are finite, and so are Ukraine's. We can keep Ukraine in the fight, and today's meeting will possibly be a step closer to peace. But given Russia's maximalist position, very few people expect something positive to come out of Washington, but it's all about avoiding the worst case.
Gentlemen, there, I'm afraid we've got to end it. Many thanks indeed for being with us today and trying to at least look into the future somewhat. Peter Zalmayev, Jean-Marc Rickli and Matthias Nelles. And thanks for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by going to the website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, join us at our Facebook page. You'll find that at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can join the conversation on X. Our handle there, at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the team here in Doha, we'll see you again. Bye for now.
Don't miss out and get the full picture. Subscribe to Al Jazeera for reliable news and expert insights. Like, share, stay ahead.